I steal life threads for a living. I witnessed victims thread is the longest I've ever seen. I've been able to see life threads since I was a little kid. I always saw them as stardust, long and tangled threads trailing after strangers on the street. My job was to steal life threads from wealthy clients. Harvey, a recent NYU graduate, had a life thread so long I was tripping over it, struggling to stay cloak and dagger. Admittedly, Harvey's thread was beautiful, a trail of stars tangled around his spine, separate threads branching up behind him. He was in high demand. Following me. Twisting around, the man himself was standing behind me, smirking. Harvey had dark, tousled hair, like he hadn't slept in weeks, amused eyes drinking me in. His life thread illuminated all of him, setting his veins alight. I could see every individual strand entangled around his heart, threaded through his brain, a burning orange light sparkling in his iris. I found my voice, my gaze glued to stray pieces of thread wrapped around his ankles. I had a moment of weakness that I was trained to suppress. The backpack is open. I nodded to his spilling books. Wait, really? He rolled his eyes. Sorry, my head was in the clouds. The guy was grinning, his life thread glowing brighter. I pitied his naivete. Can you, check I haven't lost anything? He hopped into the alley, and I followed him. Harvey crouched to pet a stray cat. I saw my chance. Pulling my gun from my jeans, I stuck it to the back of his head. Life thread is alive. It's the beating heart to the human body. I had to treat it gently. Knees. Shoved him down, and he flung his hands in the air. Are you fucking serious? He hissed. Just take my MacBook, dude. The hard part was removal. I told him to lay on his front and straddled him, pointing out my scalpel. A single incision to the nape of the neck, and there it was, spider-like tendrils already bleeding from the entrance point. All I had to do was pull, and Harvey was gone. Sorry. A whisper, ignoring his cry, his body contorting when I tangled my fingers around the thread. Pull. It came out like a loose strand of clothing, coming apart, unraveling, and I watched that glow start to darken. It wasn't until I had a handful when I realized its color. In the veins, it looked like stardust. But this, whatever this was rotting, dark, and wrong. Threads tangled and tied together. I could hear soft, individual screams, cries for death hanging on each one. Suddenly, I was being slammed against the wall, cool breath tickling my cheeks. Sharp points grazed my neck, his tongue teasing my throat. His laugh was hysterical, his life thread already mending itself, igniting in his eyes. Oh, I thought, when his teeth penetrated, and my own life thread dripped down my skin dissolved. So that's why his thread was so long. My dog won't start barking at the door. I've been living on my own for 4 years now, working a dead-end job as a porter at a car dealership with only my dog, Astro, keeping me company at home. I live in a small city in the middle of nowhere, which makes it hard to make friends, to be honest. Everyone seems to have their own circle figured out, and I feel like a total outcast. I do like to take advantage of living somewhere with a lot of scenery around, however, so I use whatever money I manage to scrape together at the end of the week to fill my truck with gas and drive up and down the nearby mountains with Astro, occasionally taking breaks from driving and going short walks and taking the view. Not only does this help with my anhedonia, it also keeps me grounded and helps me clear my mind. I've always had a bad habit of losing track of time since I was a young teen, letting the days drift by without realizing. Before I knew it, I was 22 and struggling to keep myself from losing my mind. So yesterday, I decided to get in the truck with Astro and drive over the highway into the mountains. We set out at 11 a.m., 3 hours later than the usual time we leave the house for our trips because I was having issues with my truck's transmission. There was a knock when shifting from second to third gear. For context, I drive a first-generation Tacoma my father bought me before he passed, which I know to be very reliable. However, no car is immune to at least some mechanical problems. I had noticed the knocking in the morning on my way to the gas station. I had one of the mechanics from the dealership check it out before setting out, and everything turned out to be fine, although I felt bummed out our trip may have been cut short due to setback. By 2 p.m., Astro and I made it to a large town just outside the mountains. This is one of the towns we usually stop at for our breaks between all the driving because of the size, being one of the larger towns in the area. I could tell Astro had been tired of the car ride by then. An upset 80-pound German Shepherd whining and pacing around the backseat is not something you can really ignore. So I obliged, and we stopped at a gas station just off the main road for some snacks, and for the sake of Astro's desperation. I was confused the moment I walked in. The gas station looked different than it had on many visits in the past. It was cleaner than usual, and the flickering light near the back of the ceiling had been fixed. The wall seems to have been freshly painted, although the flooring was still the same creaky, scratched wooden flooring that has always been there. The man at the counter was new. We visited this gas station on nearly every trip we took up to the mountains, and by now we had been coming here for every week, for months. So we had known and become familiar with manager Richard, who also appeared to be the only employee and was always happily ringing up customers. The new man at the counter was old, maybe in his 60s, and he wore a bright blue polo shirt and sunglasses. The top of his head was completely bald, and the sides of his head covered in short, thin white hair. His name tag read William. As soon as he saw I had walked in with Astro, he stood from his chair behind the counter and spoke. "You can't bring that dog in here," he said in a stern tone. Before I could respond, he continued. "Take him outside or you'll be asked to leave." I was shocked. "Bring him in here every week. The manager has never had an issue with it," I argued. "The manager is gone, which means I'm in charge," he replied. "Gone? What do you mean Richard is gone?" I asked. I really liked Richard. He was at least a decade older than me, in his 30s maybe, and he was always welcomed Astro and I into the gas station. "He hasn't shown up in over a week," he snarled. "If you have any questions, go ask the police department. I don't know anything else and I don't care to explain. Get that dog out of my store," he ranted. I politely nodded and took Astro's lease and left without buying anything. The whole encounter was startling. What do you mean Richard was gone? I had just seen him a little over a week ago. Despite my confusion and the terrible encounter at the gas station, I decided I wouldn't let this ruin the rest of my trip. I could tell Astro was still desperate for a break, so I drove an hour north towards the lake we've been to before. At this point, it was already 3 p.m. and we hadn't eaten, so I unpacked our food and we set up on the bed of my truck near the shore. It was beautiful. The water was crystal clear and a beautiful shade of greenish blue. The same pine trees we had seen beside the road on the drive there lined the outside of the lake. I could even see the mountains watching over the forest, with the clouds just covering the tallest peaks. After our lunch break, I began my walk with Astro around the lake, and we walked for over 2 hours around the entire shore of the lake. It was surprisingly peaceful. Usually Astro enjoyed chasing squirrels and ducks on our walks. There weren't any squirrels or ducks around this time, or anything at all for that matter. I didn't even remember the last time we saw a car beside us on the road. In the fall, by this point the sun had already began to set, so I thought it'd be best to pack it up and call it a day. After I packed up, I went to start the truck. I only made it about 100 yards up the road when I heard the same knocking from the transmission I had heard this morning, except now it was between every gear. Soon the knocking turned to the grueling sound of grinding metal, and I knew we weren't going anywhere. "Piece of shit," I thought to myself. I knew a tow truck would take hours to reach us. Even then I'd have to hike near a tower for any sort of cell signal and to find a ride back into town. I don't have much of a choice, however. I took a flashlight from the glove box and hopped out with Astro by my side. Thankfully, I was familiar with the area and I knew a trail that would lead us to higher ground, and hopefully, closer to a cell tower. It was pitch black at this point. There was very little light pollution in the sky. I could actually see the stars for once. I thought that despite my situation, it was beautiful to see the sky in this way, and I was grateful for that. The trail was mostly the same the entire way through, lined with pine trees and thick leafy bushes. We walked for 15 minutes or so when I started to smell something odd. It was the unmistakable, grotesque smell of death. The second I smelled it, I knew what it was, and Astro just seemed to know as well. There wasn't another putrid smell like that out there. However, being in a forest near the mountains, this wasn't exactly something too concerning. We were out in nature after all, and there isn't anything more natural than death. I looked around and couldn't see or smell where it was coming from though, so I covered my nose and kept walking. We only made it about 5 minutes further when I caught a glimpse of something from the corner of my eye. From my peripheral vision I could see a gathering of bushes rustling in the distance. It wasn't the kind of rustling caused by the wind, and as a matter of fact there wasn't any wind or other sounds around. It was dead silent the whole way there, and the sound of rustling leaves had broken the silence. I pointed my flashlight towards the bushes, and thankfully I didn't see 2 huge eyes staring back at me. I stayed for maybe 10 seconds, hoping to see a squirrel or an owl or anything other than a mountain lion come out from behind the bushes. I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared to this point. Astro and I were completely vulnerable to a hungry mountain lion or bear. So, in a moment of stupidity, probably caused by fear, I shouted, "Hello?" directly at the bush, as if I was hoping it would say something back. I waited 10 seconds before turning my flashlight back to the path ahead of me, and just as I had it turned back to the trail, I heard a sound come from behind the bushes. It was a voice. "Hello?" it replied in a frightening tone. It wasn't a random voice. It was Richard's voice. I flicked my flashlight toward the bush so fast I nearly dropped it. This time I was right, and I did see two massive, shining eyes staring directly at me from between the bushes. My heart sank to the very bottom of my chest, and I felt my knees nearly give out. By this point, Astro was barking in a way I'd never heard before, a shrill, terrified sound as if he understood exactly what was going on. Then, the thing from the bushes rushed out and gave chase. Astro and I stumbled down the trail as fast as we could. The thing was on our tail, and I could hear its breath quicken with every step it gave. It ran on all fours, making a distinct galloping sound. We ran for what felt like forever until I made it back to the truck and jumped in as fast as I could. I closed the door behind me and looked back, half expecting the thing was right behind me and ripped me straight for my truck. Then I realized it wasn't behind me. Neither was Astro. I felt hopeless at this point. I immediately dialed 911 and waited. It took over an hour for the police to arrive, though it felt like forever to me. After the attack, it returned to the same dead silence from earlier. I stared out the window, hoping to see Astro walk out of the tree line, jump right into the back seat, just like he had on all our trips. Once the police finally arrived, they escorted me back to town. They took me down to the police station and gave me a rundown. They had found Richard's body, just a few yards from where the trail and I had been walking was, behind a thick lining of bushes. There was still no sign of Astro, however, and whatever chased us, it was gone. It left no trail. It was as if the whole chase hadn't even happened. I booked a room at a hotel just outside the jungle forest, as it was the only one that would take a reservation so late in the day. I unpacked my bag and started uncontrollably crying. My one true best friend was gone. I was hoping this was all a nightmare. I'd wake up from in the morning. I laid down on the bed, still dressed in the same clothes I was wearing earlier. Just as I began to close my eyes, I heard a dog barking just outside the sliding glass door of my hotel room. I turned over to face it. The blinds covered the glass doors, but I could still see the outline of a giant figure lit up by the moonlight. I recognized it was Astro's bark, and it was the same shrill bark he made up on that trail.